Thank you for coming. We're going to be talking about getting Smart on FHIR apps into EHR App Stores and App Stores in general, and how OAuth and FHIR work with going to market. And yeah, so the talk today, we're going to be covering my introduction, my qualifications, why I'm speaking here, App Store ecosystem, inspiration and precedents, Smart on FHIR, OAuth, EHR App Store registration, and business and regulatory requirements and considerations. My name is Abigail Watson. I'm a clinical informaticist based out of Chicago and the UChicago community. 15 years of experience in this industry. I've been a MUMPS administrator, a Cerner admin, Epic developer. I work, have been developing a business startup called Symptomatic that does EHR Plus apps, and we had some vision of some apps that we wanted to see in these emerging app stores. We have a longitudinal timeline. We have some investments in geo-mapping technology, epidemiology, transit planning for patients. And we wanted to see these apps get into the market, and we were like, we're going to avail ourselves of FHIR. So disclaimer, if you copy from one book, that's plagiarism, but if you copy from many books, that's research. And there's some sensitive material in this presentation, and we're probably not going to be able to share these slides. Symptomatic has done a lot of research for this talk, but we don't claim to represent any of the businesses herein. And we consider the screenshots, we're trying to use them with fair use, and all of this is subject to change. This is our experience using these other products, and we're trying to have a dialogue with other FHIR developers and to kind of communicate what our experience has been navigating all of this. So app stores. So it all kind of kicked off with iTunes, and this kind of is a great example of both seeing apps in an app store that you can go and just purchase and download. Apple really kind of kicked it off, and seeing these things together, you're kind of like, how can we get into the app store also? I have this idea. I want to be in there also. Cerner also has an app gallery that has things that you can get your app into it. App Orchard from Epic. We're seeing this. How can we get that app maybe in both of these app stores? We also see things like GitHub Marketplace, and Microsoft has recently purchased GitHub, and you might see that also in the future playing in this emerging market. So we have these different stores where companies can go to market and bring their product to other people and maybe pay your salary along the way. What kicked this all off? Well, it was the inspiration was obviously Apple, and what Apple did, which was a little novel that a lot of people who haven't taken an app into their app store, was they created a whole They made an application for writing apps, and they made an application for submitting apps to a market. And so, if you've ever been an Apple developer and registered iOS app, you have this thing called iOS Connect, App Store Connect. And you register, you get your Apple ID, you register, and then with Xcode, they start walking you through how to submit and prepare your app for submission, enter additional information, archive, validate, test, upload, submit, and review process, and the whole thing. That's all very kind of abstract, and the nitty-gritty of it is more detailed. Behind the scenes, any of your fellow Apple developers who are making iOS apps are navigating these websites. I don't know how well you can see this because white on white background and all that, but the general idea is that you have to fill out the name, and you have to have a privacy policy for your app. You have to have some encoding information. They give you an ID for your app. And then it bumps into this kind of management panel where you can do things like specify how much your app costs, how much, what the analytics are, like how many people are downloading it. And so when you go through the Apple developer program, you get this kind of management dashboard. Let's see here. We went through this slide. And here's the pricing schedule where if you had like a premium product that you could price it out, they kind of give you options. You can price it at a free tier. You could go up to $1,000. There aren't many apps in the App Store that believe that they're offering $1,000 of value, but you can go up there. So once you create the price schedule, then you prepare for the app for submission. And you have to do things like you have to upload screenshots. You have to upload keywords and promotional text and description. And interestingly, you have to have a support URL. You have to have a marketing URL. So just in these few pages, besides all the app that you have to develop, you also have to do things like have 3 supporting web pages. You have to have that privacy policy, you have to have your support URL, you have to have your marketing URL. And so these are kind of the hidden costs of going to market with an Apple app, okay? You have to have a graphic designer to design the screenshots, or you have to take the screenshots. You have to prep those media assets, which are going to be part of your marketing and branding. So you have these kind of supporting assets that you have to get in place, and then you have to have a thumbnail, you have to have an icon for your app, you have to have copyright info, you have to have a business address, which many people who start off as developers might not be thinking about the business aspect of, oh, I have to have a bank account to receive the money that you're going to make. So, so you have to have things like a mailing address. You have to stand up all of these things as part of submitting your app to the App Store. So EHR store requirements were roughly, we see the major EHR vendors kind of moving in the same direction of following this model. They aren't doing it exactly the same. They're adjusting it to the needs of the EHR market, for the healthcare market. So back to Cerner, this was presented just in the last talk. You go to their open page, their code, and you see this general model that you submit, they review it, it kicks it back, you do it a little bit more, you validate it, it gets, maybe it doesn't get approved, and you go through the cycle a little bit more, and eventually it gets listed, and that's in the store. Now, when we think of a store, there's storage and there's marketplace. And the marketplaces were originally designed as storage, and then that you had to pay to access something in the storage. So you can get listed without asking for money. So listing an app is different than selling an app, if that makes sense. It's a free app versus a paid app. The developer ecosystem, more of the same. You have developers creating apps, they publish, they client, and so forth. Epic, no, that's next slide. So on the specifications, we see a common theme in the apps with OAuth, OpenID, and these are driven by the FHIR standard. So Smart on FHIR seems to be the emerging paradigm that's kind of common between where the ecosystem and the industry seems to be moving to. So we're going to talk about some of these things. But we also have specifics. If you dive into the documents and the agreements, you see things, requirements like we want it to be well-behaved, we want to ensure patient safety, we want it to be reliable, scalable, we want it to integrate well, we want to respect ownership, so forth. Don't modify our code. Play well. If we're going to share the sandbox with you, be responsible with it. But we also have things like that data use policy, like show a data use policy to the users, obtain consent, secure the data, and so forth. So putting all of these things together, you kind of across the spectrum, your general business development checklist for bringing an app to market through either the Google, Epic, Allscripts. What we're seeing is you need a business bank account at one level, which is going to require organizing your business, mailing address, registered agent, articles of incorporation, EIN, tax ID. You're probably going to want some type of insurance for this. You're going to want errors and omissions. You're going to want cybersecurity. You're going to want your policies and procedures for HIPAA. We're going to talk about some of that, quality control systems. We're going to talk about some of that more in a bit. Stakeholder communications. These are just like a bunch of websites that you have to kind of create in support of your app. You want the homepage. You want documentation on how it works, how to install it. You want some type of help page, marketing materials. Privacy policy has been iterated and repeated multiple times by multiple companies. You have to do it. And in terms of service. Now can you consolidate some of this? Sure, maybe. But what's going to happen is as you put it into different stores, one store is going to ask for a privacy policy, the other store is going to ask for a marketing page, the other one's, and so you kind of have to, it's not quite a lowest common denominator, but it's kind of like you have to plan for all of it. So there are these, this slew of websites. Media assets also. You have to have thumbnails, logos, icons, screenshots. If you have a mobile device, you have an extra dozen splash pages and that you have. And we spend a fair bit of time just doing kind of the graphic design prep in getting the media assets prepared. So this is kind of what you're getting yourself into when you start down this road. Now then, the reason that we do this is because there's some type of profit sharing or gain sharing at the end of the day, and you're thinking that you can make some money. Apple and Epic, we see 70-30 split on the high end. You kind of have to be prepared for that much of gain sharing, giving a 30% tax if you want to think of it that way. Depending on the model, you can get it down as low as 85-15 split. Same thing with Epic. They cap it at 25%. They also do a metering aspect where they want to meter, and the latest, subject to change, is 4,000. No, you know what? It got cut off. My apologies. The API tracking is something like 4,000 per million API calls. Regardless, be prepared for an upper bound of 25 to 30% of sharing. And when we talk about the hosting costs, when you start getting HIPAA costs, that can be another 10 or 15%. So you're more costs. Smart on FHIR. So this has been a common theme amongst all the vendors that we've looked at, and we get back to here. You want your FHIR, you want your OAuth, OpenID, HTML, and we all know what FHIR is. I guess I don't have to talk about this. But when you stand up your OAuth, that's a little bit more complicated. A lot of people don't, OAuth is like this requirement that they need to do, but oftentimes people are either out of sight, out of mind, or they get mired in it, and it's what they do, and they want to get done with it. So this isn't the best diagram, but generally speaking, you have you have an authentication server, you have a resource server, and you have your client ID, and the client has to ask the authorization server for, can I speak to this other server? And you get this back and forth. You have to register, like this little purple individual up there. That's like the registration process that we just kind of did all those screenshots. And that's a different part of the OAuth flow. Is like you have to register your app and get that client ID. And we'll cover some of that in just a bit. And then once that's done, then your app can do all this fetching. It goes back and forth. It fetches data, and it puts it back and stores it, and so on and so forth. OAuth. Let's talk about the precedents for like the popular OAuth servers out there. If you've never set up an OAuth server, it's not a lot of fun. It's kind of a painful process, but Facebook was one of the early OAuth, a popular OAuth service that people used. And you know it in terms of the sign in with button. So sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google. You've seen these buttons. And with the proliferation of OAuth and FHIR among the healthcare ecosystem, if you think that through, we're probably going to be moving in the next few years towards sign in with Epic, sign in with Cerner, sign in with Walgreens, sign in with Blue Cross Blue Shield. And we're going to see these services that implement OAuth because it's required by FHIR, and the end result are buttons kind of populated throughout the web and in apps that are sign in with iHealth Life and sign in with Fitbit and so on and so forth. So again, we see the same kind of things as privacy policies and domains and icons, and you have to kind of set up your OAuth server. Client token and your security. And so GitHub, another popular OAuth service. You register a new OAuth application, and you have to put in your application name, your homepage URL, and the callback URL. So this is a common theme in registering OAuth. When this is installed, this is the the page I meant to talk about the sign-in with buttons. You also get on user profiles, you get that OAuth token that you can revoke. And so when we talk about those well-behaved applications, people probably need to start thinking about, like, how do you turn off the application? How do you disable it? How do you make it well-behaved and follow the we call it maybe the life cycle of the OAuth implementation from when the user decides to install it to when they decide they don't want it anymore. And then you kind of fill out all the data and you press register and you register an app. And then you get client IDs and secret IDs, and you can share these around, and they're used for in your app, and you can take this page and go off and implement. So the App Store registration is, if there's a thesis to this talk, a learned lesson, is that generally speaking, registering your app for a FHIR-based EHR App Store is a process of registering an OAuth application. So with Cerner Care, we have some create account. You have you specify the type of application you're going to create. Here's those launch URLs and that redirect URLs, the same as what you have in GitHub, the same as what well, the older version of Facebook had. They're retiring it a little bit. Which FHIR specification is your does your smart app require OAuth 2? The scopes, which are related to which features that you want. And when you register, you have to select, like, which resources that you're going to use. Does your geolocation application need scheduling and medications? Probably not. And so during the review process, you're probably going to get flagged if you're registering a geolocation app that needs medications, unless you have a rationale for it. And with that rationale, you have to document it. So this is the kind of validation and inspection that people need to be prepared in the submission process. So, yeah. And then when you're all done, it lists on a list, and you're like, ooh, I have one app. It's common to have testing apps and different environments, and then once you do one, then you want to do more, and you maybe make a business out of it. Epic is much the same. Open Epic, anybody can sign up and get much of the same. You have a list of applications that you're working on, and same thing is we're going to be doing a documentation URL. We have the name, we have a redirect URL, and then we also have these scopes. Cerner does it in a vertical list. Epic does a paragraph. I mean, other than that, same basic process. When you're done, you can submit it to the sandbox, or you can submit it to be reviewed and validated. And so that button doesn't, it's hidden until you get all the pieces right, and then it pops up and you're like, ooh, wow, that's new. Like, I guess we can submit it now. The App Orchard, much the same. Same general thing as client IDs, documentation URL, who's it for, which scopes you're going to be using. We also see the thumbnails. Thumbnails, media assets, the listings for the store itself. So you have to get all of your marketing materials prepped before you go through this process. Screenshots and yeah. So So that's all the screenshots, and now we're going to kind of talk about when you've decided you want to go through this process, how to get from here to there. Well, regulatory is going to be a big issue. Okay, and the regulatory considerations that we've seen generally fall into HIPAA, FDA, ONC, and MACRA. Good news is that FHIR kind of takes care of MACRA. Not everybody's doing FDA. ONC is about meaningful use, which is a maybe, but HIPAA is going to be the one that, by and large, it's your first immediate consideration. It's the one that is going to be big bucks, and it's what you have to kind of get in place first. HIPAA, generally speaking, requires SSL certificates, and in all the previous screenshots that we showed, I don't want to call it the continual thorn in our side, but HTTP versus HTTPS, you're constantly kind of navigating that. Encrypted data at rest. This is way more expensive than people are prepared for. It's orders of magnitude more expensive than consumer hosting. You have to put in regulatory review processes. You have to hire administrators. Somebody has to pay for keeping that data encrypted. We'll get to some of the pricing in a bit. User accounts. This isn't the days of DOS where everyone shares a single account, although your iPhone you have to be careful about, like, they've addressed the issues, but back in the very first versions of iPhone, iOS, there was more of a shared user model that it was kind of a question mark about whether you could make a HIPAA compliant app on iOS. Nowadays, they've shored that up and put in different user contexts and so forth. You have to have user counts, policies and procedures. Everyone gets focused on the technical considerations of HIPAA, but they don't think about the policy issues. And so if you're going to stand up a business and an application that abides by EHR rules, you have to have a slew of policies and procedures in place. The company that Symptomatic, we have a data management, data integrity, data backups, risk management policy, data retention policy, incident response, configuration management, approved tools, intrusion detection, system access, disaster recovery. You kind of have to think about how are we keeping this data, and what do we do when it goes wrong, and what are, like plan ahead, and each of these is, a page or two, and so that's 20 pages of policies and procedures that you and your team need to be on board for if you're going to be HIPAA compliant and meet the storage requirements for these apps. It's possible to offload some of these costs to other people. They will do it for money, and it is kind of expensive. Prototyping, we've managed to get like $30 a month kind of hosting, not too difficult. You have if you're going to do code storage, that's $200 per month per 125 repositories. We have a node application stack that we like, Meteor and Galaxy, but service level agreements can get up to $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 a month. But that's small compared to the actual HIPAA tier. AWS, we found, starts at $400 per month per server. Aptable, which is our favored hosting environment, is $1,000 per month per server. These kind of prices easily and quickly get you into a $12,000 a year hosting model. And what that $12,000 does is that underwrites a system engineer on their part to manage your HIPAA compliant app that's going to be having healthcare data in it. And this is starting monies, like doing 2,000, 3,000 a month, like once it's in production, like easy. Database, encrypted database on the market, also ridiculously expensive from the consumer perspective. We're not talking about consumer hosting here. We're talking about HIPAA grade regulatory oversight that can pass regulatory review. Be prepared to have your funding in place for how to address those kind of things. You also have some like straight up like federal registry FDA kind of requirements. If your app has any type of signatures, electronic signatures, be prepared for regulatory review. Be prepared for somebody to be investigating on CFR 2111 for electronic signatures. But that's a particular type of application. Most of the applications that we see fall under the requirement that is most applicable is related to quality control systems. If you bring an app into production, you're likely going to need either on CFR 8020.75 or CFR 170.315 quality management system, you're going to need some type of quality control system. And that means something like Circle. We recommend continuous integration, something that's running a bank of tests on every commit of code. And this is the kind of documentation that a group like the FDA would want to see, and you could say, here's our validation and verification tests. Similarly, the Touchstone project on the server side can cover much of the QA and test-driven development, the validation verification tests for server products, which you get this similar kind of thing. You get the red and green, like this commit passed, this one failed, and so forth. And lastly, you circle back down to the MACRA requirement, and FHIR recommends a FHIR safety checklist, which includes things like encryption on the wire, which is that SSL certificate, which is related to HIPAA. So we see kind of the same requirements being repeated by different people, only this is protocol level items. So before you even start on sending that application to validation, you're probably going to want to run through the FHIR safety checklist. And that wraps up our learnings. It's been an adventure so far, and we look forward to future discussions. And